now he can be so tough, no?
Yeah, but I really his way of going about it. Although, yeah, it makes a valid point.
I think the rabbis totally overreacted.
I think they overreacted. I think they made a tactical error. Now, the Chayrim, or even if they disagreed with what he wrote, they had an issue with promoting the rational school of Rishonim because they said that the consensus of the rabbis adopted the Kabbalistic view.
Right.
Okay, fair enough. That's a fair argument. But they made a tactical error. It was a tactical error. You put the book in Chayrim, and look what you've done.
Everybody wants to read it.
Exactly. Everybody bought the book.
His books are absolutely fantastic.
Right.
Every possible stuff that comes up in the
Yeah, I know. Although Yisachar and Michael are not here, are two regulars. I don't know.
That's the problem. We get too many people last
week. They usually send me, if they don't make it, they usually send me an email. Okay, but anyway, so I'm very happy to have Chaim here. Oh, so that's funny. Just this week, I got an email from somebody. Yeah, so your neighbor.
Yes, he's a neighbor.
So he emailed me and he asked me that. So I told, his name is Arnold? I have his email. He sent me an email. Ben Ari, yes. So what's his first name? What's his name? Yeah, so it's actually, my grandfather was trying to get out of Romania in the 1950s. So he basically bought the papers of a non-Jew that died, but his death was never reported to the government officials. So he bought the papers, and he got out of Romania. Exactly. It was under the communists. No, so that's why I said my grandfather took on the name Dick in the 1950s. So therefore, beyond any. That's right. So therefore, I don't have aside from my father's one brother and his sons, I have no relatives with the name of Dick. Close relatives. Okay. So,
I'm waiting for this guy to write his family
history.
There's something called
He's living on stolen papers. You can't notarize this guy.
Okay. So anyway, so Menachem is with us on Zoom. Menachem Nussbaum. There are some people that are with us on Zoom, so I don't want to. Yeah.
Do you know who his mishpacha is?
I know a bit about his family. I know his father was good friends with Rabbi Kushalovsky's brother. Okay. So I know some of the family connection. But obviously nobody.
Do you know who his wife's parents are?
Who are his wife's parents? The Samsons. Okay, a wealthy family. Okay.
It's an understatement.
So you don't start up with wealthy people. That's the moral of the story.
That's the moral of the story. And he can sit there and take them all on without any problem.
Okay. But anyway, so getting to today's topic, I think we're going to talk about this topic. We're going to give this topic one shiur. Maybe I'll finish it this year, but I'd rather just take it slowly. And I always have a little bit of a dilemma whether or not I should go slowly, but then I'm concerned if the shiur drags on for too many classes. Yeah, the Merriman comes outside, sorry. But then I'm concerned that if the class drags on for too long, then people lose interest. So, so take tangent. So basically, Chaim is here with us. So as Chaim, as you mentioned that you play tennis with your right hand.
Yes.
And you write with your left hand. So I mentioned the other week that I do my own little survey. And in my own little survey of people that are what I call semi-ambidextrous, if that's the right technical definition, that's always the case. I always find that they write with the left, and they play tennis or do sports, or
I eat soup with my right.
You eat soup with your right. Interesting. Okay. So basically, I always find that the writing is with the left, and everything else is done with the right. Okay. It used to be the other way about 100 years ago.
Do you play a musical instrument?
I used to play clarinet.
The clarinet. Okay.
Use both hands? Is
You
that
have to use both hands.
Use both hands.
But no, I'm saying, but is that you can't play it like this?
No.
They don't make left clarinets?
Not that I'm aware of.
All right. So in any case, basically, that's with my little survey. My grandmother, she grew up. She was a full-fledged She was fully fledged left-handed, but she was forced to write with the right hand. That was the way the educational system was built. That they had this idea in their head that all the kids had to write with the right hand. So that's why they used to have the other system where they were writing with the right and the left. Okay, usually I find naturally, like in your case, Chaim, that is usually the case. I've yet to meet anybody in my little survey, which isn't very scientific, but I'm talking about a dozen people maybe that does it the other way around. It's always like in your case where
What's also very interesting, forcing people who are naturally left-handed to write has, according to research, had some serious consequences.
Oh yes, I mentioned it has adverse emotional effects. Correct. In other words, they find when you force a person to write with the right hand when they're naturally left-handed, so it has an adverse emotional effect on the person. We mentioned that the other week. So
also in French, the word for left is gauche.
Is gauche.
Now gauche means and gauche.
I don't interrupt you, but the people with us on Zoom can't hear the questions. So I get complaints from the people on Zoom. They said we can't hear the questions, right? So I'm happy to take questions, but I'll speak up, okay? Or if you have a question, somebody suggested what they do at TED Talks. And what they do, they give the person the microphone. Okay, so if you have a question, then Chaim, you need to take the microphone, okay?
Just as a tangent, I shipped all the grandkids home yesterday, and I don't know how it came up, but they can't write script.
They can't write script. Okay.
They learn script in the 3rd grade, and that's it. They never use it again. Ever.
Okay.
Seriously, ask your kids if they can write a script. You'll see.
No, they can't because today all the writing is on the computer. So basically, just to give a quick recap, right? Basically, so we talked about the Gemara in Menachos Tam Lam Vav, the first number on your reference sheet. The Gemara gives 3 sources as to how we know that you put tefillin on the left hand or you put tefillin on the weaker hand. The first source is, it says in the Torah, Yadcha. Yadcha, unless specified otherwise, is the left hand. It says Yadcha Zesma. The Gemara brings a number of psukim where we see that unless specified otherwise, Yadcha means the left. The Gemara brings a pasuk Av Yadi Yas Te'eretz V'Yimini Tibcha Shamayim. Okay. The second source is Reb Natan Ukshartem Uchtavte Makti B'Yamin Afkshir B'Yamin, that you write with the right hand. So therefore, when you do the act of tying, you also do the act of tying the tefillin. You do it with the right hand. The third source is Rav Ashi, source Miyadcha, right, which has an extra hay. So it could also be read Miyadcha Yad Keha, the weaker hand. Okay. As we mentioned in the last Shiur, number 2 on the reference sheet, the Tosfot mentions that his Rabbi, according to Samar Shadam, was the Rihat Zakein, had a doubt regarding somebody like Chaim, where he writes with one hand, he does other activities with the other hand. So what's a more important factor? Is the writing the primary factor, or is the Roiv Malachas, most of the actions, is that the primary factor? Okay, so Tosfos was in doubt. Tosfos in Shabbos mentions that Rav Ashi, right? Rav Ashi is the later one of the last Talmudic sages. Rav Ashi and Ravina, they edited the Gemara, or the son of Rav Ashi edited the Gemara. Rav Ashi edited the Gemara, but he was at the very end of the period of the Gemara. There's halacha of halacha kabasrei that we always rule in accordance with the later sages. So therefore, the assumption is that we adopt Rav Ashi's source, that miyadcha yadkea, the weaker hand. And the Igros Moshe points out, Igros Moshe number 4 in your reference sheet, Arachaim Chelik Dalet Simon Aleph, that the Rif only brings Rav Ashi's source as to how we know you put tefillin on the weaker hand. He doesn't bring the other sources in the Gemara. And that is because the Rif rules in accordance with Rav Ashi. The Igros Moshe didn't see the Eshkol. The Eshkol says the same thing. It was included in last week's reference sheet. But the Eshkol, one of the Rishonim, the father-in-law of the Ravid, he also said that we rule in accordance with Rav Ashi. Right? What is the practical manifestation of ruling in accordance with Rav Ashi? It's in our case that we're dealing with. Okay? If you learn the source of Kshartem Uchtavtem, that just as you write with the right hand, so you're supposed to do the act of tying with the right hand, then writing would be the primary variable. Okay, because we're linking the writing with the tying. But if you're in Yodcha, the weaker hand, right? The weaker hand is the hand that you don't play tennis with, right? Okay, the hand that you play tennis with is objectively stronger, and that's why you use it to whack the ball, because you get more strength out of your hand. Okay. So that's the proposal of the Eshkol, that depending on which source you use to determine that you have to put tefillin on the weaker hand, whether it's ksharat mechtavtem or whether it's yad chad, that will determine what to do in a case where somebody writes with one hand and does roiv malachas with the other hand. So the Rif, according to the Igros Moshe and what he was mechaven to the Eshkol, it's roiv malachas. Okay, it's the hand that you play tennis with. So from now on, I'm going to use the tennis. Factor. Okay. So the hand that you play tennis with, that's the hand that determines which hand you put tefillin on, not the writing. That's the first proof that the Rishonim bring. We mentioned the other week that the Rosh rules that playing tennis is more important. Right? The Rav Malachas, that's what determines the hand you should put on tefillin on. He brings it from the Sefer Truma, who was a student of the Riaz Zaken. And that was the ruling of the Rambam, according to Rav Shtarmuch, because the Rambam says Iter Yad. With regards to other areas in halacha, for example, doing service in the Beis HaMikdash, certainly writing is not a factor. So if you say Iter Yad means left-handed. So if you say Iter Yad without stipulating otherwise, the assumption is that there's no difference with regards to the definition of Iter Yad vis-a-vis tefillin versus the definition of Iter Yad when it comes to other areas in halacha. Which would mean that according to the Rambam, just as the stronger hand, roiv malachas, determines in other areas of halacha, like service in the Beis HaMikdash, so too does roiv malachas determine which hand you're going to put tefillin on. Okay? The second proof, right, the roiv malachas determines, is the Gemara in Bechairos. Interesting Gemara. The Gemara raises a scientific query. Let's read the Gemara in Brachas number 5 on the reference sheet. Taner Rabban Iter Yad Ben Yad Ben Beregel Pasal. Halacha is that in the Beis HaMikdash, if a kohen would like to do service in the Beis HaMikdash, he has to be right-handed. And not only that, has to be right-footed. The Gemara says that if somebody's in Iter Yad, either he's left-handed or he's left-footed, the halacha is he's disqualified to do service in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara raises the question, what is the halacha with regards to Shayl B'Shnei Yadav? Somebody that has equal control over both hands. Okay, so Rabbi says he's disqualified from doing service in the Beis HaMikdash. V'cham say he is kosher to do service in the Beis HaMikdash. Now the Gemara says it's an interesting point. The Gemara says that they're disagreeing with regards to a scientific fact. Mar Savar, Rabbi maintains you know why he has equal control over both hands? Because he was born left-handed. And what happened is that his left hand grew weaker. And after his left hand grew weaker, he ended up having equal control over his right and his left hand. That's Rebbe's theory. Okay? It's interesting to see if anybody wants to do scientific research to see what is the root of the ambidextrous person, of the ambidextrous phenomena. You can look it up. That's not something that I researched. I'm only quoting what the Gemara says. Umar Sarva, the Chacham maintained it's the opposite. He was born right-handed. What happened is that he grew stronger in his left hand, and that's why he has equal control over his right and left hand. So which means to say, according to Rabbi, if somebody's ambidextrous at the root, he's really left-handed, or he began as a left-handed person. According to the Chachamim, if somebody's ambidextrous, he really began as a right-handed person.
It's an interesting argument. What do they base it on?
Maybe they conducted empirical. Maybe they did empirical research. I don't know why they were led to opposite conclusions. Right. But you see, very often the Gemara gives examples. The Gemara in Sanhedrin Daf Yud, for example, says that Rava was it Rav or Rava? I can't remember. The Gemara in Sanhedrin, I think Daf Yud, says that he wanted to learn about mum, which blemishes in animals render the behemoth not kosher. Rather, to be more specific, what behemoth is permanent, what blemish is only passing. So he says he spent 10 years with the, I don't know, he spent an extended period of time with the cowboys or with the shepherds. He spent an extended time with the shepherds to learn about animals. So they did engage in some empirical research. It's interesting that the Gemara in Bechairos makes an extraordinary claim that if somebody doesn't urinate when he needs to, he could become a eunuch. Right? An extraordinary claim because the Gemara claims that there are two channels, right? There are two channels in the male member, one for semen and one for urine. Okay? That doesn't add up at all. Right? You do a simple autopsy and any human being will see that higher up in the body there, it's that way, but not within the male member.
There's a lot of things like that. Just read Slifkin's books.
Right. So let me tell you something interesting. The Chazon Ish in Even Ezer Siman Yud, he says something fascinating. The Chazon Ish says, and this is from the handwriting of the Chazon Ish, he says he went to the doctor to learn about biological evolution. Chazon Ish wrote that. He says, could such a thing could this be attributed, the fact that we don't see to not Shana Teva, he says, the change that happened min hadayrais umin hamedinais. That's what he writes. He says biological changes that evolve from generation to generation and from region to region. Okay, now, if this is one of the evolutionary changes, that there was some sort of anatomical change in the male member, it would be interesting. You would find some fossil and ancient, if they uncovered ancient bodies, I would expect that they would find. So even if the Chazon Ish, if you could attribute this discrepancy to evolutionary change, you would expect there to be some sort of evidence, scientific evidence, that I doubt that there is. Okay?
They have all those mummies from Egypt.
Yeah, the mummies in Egypt. I don't think they found. Although, did they ever dissect those mummies in Egypt? Did they ever dissect the male member?
They do CT scan. They don't dissect people now to see if they have.
Oh yeah, you don't need to dissect. You can run a CAT scan. But did they ever do that? I'm sure they did. Yeah,
they did.
For sure. I'm sure they did.
Video.
Yeah. Exactly. Okay, and also if you take the Darwinistic approach to evolution, you would expect there to be some sort of interim change. In other words, you'd find it would be a gradual change, where I guess progressive. Exactly. I guess at some point in time where you have like two tubes, and then also at some stage you'd find the two tubes merging somehow. I'm talking out of conjecture.
I hate to bring this back, but
yeah.
That's exactly a big part of Splitskin's fight. That they didn't know. They knew what they knew.
But the problem is like this: the male anatomy is something that could easily be verified. And even in their times,
they could do an autopsy after somebody died.
But they must have done autopsy. I mean, they must have had some sort of autopsy at some point in time where they could examine a corpse and see if there was one or two.
So maybe
or they must have performed.
So somebody could have misread it.
I don't know.
I don't either.
But the Chazon Ish, I'm just saying, the Chazon Ish recognized the problem. Right. And what I find fascinating is that he said he went to the doctor to learn about biological evolution. Okay, that's totally an aside, okay? Right. So this is another example where we see the scientific debate, if you like, between the Chachamim. So the Sefer Truma, again, he was the student of the Ri, he's quoted by the Rosh. He maintained that Rav Malachas, in this case where one does tennis with one hand and writes with the other hand, he says tennis is more important than writing, okay? And vis-a-vis putting on tefillin. So he says, Mashma de basar koicha gvura, bu basar chalshos tali milsa. You see that the main focus in the Gemara and Bechairos has to do with strength. Okay? I think I want to explain a little bit more what the Sefer Truma is trying to prove. I mentioned the other week, and I put it here in the reference sheet too, Rav Moshe Feinstein also proposed a scientific theory. He wanted to say that usually where people have this division, with one hand they write, with the other hand they do everything else, he says because the way the brain is wired, don't ask me to get into too much either because I'm not a doctor, I'm not a scientist, but this is what Rav Moshe Feinstein wanted to propose, that the way the brain is wired, he says there's a certain part of the brain that regulates things that control precision. For example, if you're writing, you need to be more precise. Right? It requires precision, or drawing art, right? To draw paintings, or sculpturing, playing the clarinet. You see, so usually, right? It's usually the same hand that's better precision is also the stronger hand. He says, but sometimes the way the brain is wired, for whatever reason, he says things that have to do with precision, right? The brain might direct one hand to do a better job, and things that have to do with strength, the brain directs the other hand to whatever. I don't know if that. I don't want to talk too much because it's not my field. I'm not a scientist. But this is the theory that Rav Moshe Feinstein wanted to propose. So you see that idea, I think, could be highlighted in the Sefer Truma, where if you look at the bold section, he says, the botar koach ugvura. What does it mean, koach ugvura? Strength. Okay? Gvura means the power. So you see that I think Rav Moshe Feinstein's theory is somewhat highlighted in the wording of the Sefer Truma. Okay? So the Sefer Truma has determined that when it comes to things like avodah, things like service in the Beis HaMikdash, certainly Rav Malachas HaKaveh is certainly the hand that you do most things with. That's the more important variable. So I think that to complete the explanation of the Sefer Truma, you have to say that if the Gemara didn't specify, if the Gemara stated that an Iter Yad puts tefillin on the left hand, since the Gemara didn't stipulate otherwise, the default supposition is that the criteria of an Iter Yad vis-a-vis tefillin is the same as an Iter Yad with regards to all other areas of halacha. Because if there was a difference between how you define an Iter Yad regarding tefillin versus how you define Iter Yad regarding avoid in the Beis HaMikdash, you would expect the Gemara to specify. Okay? So that's, I think, the underlying proof of the Sefer Truma. The third proof, number 7, is the Gemara in Brachos Lamed Vav that we mentioned. Remember that there are 3 sources in the Gemara as to how we know, right, that Iter Yad, that a left-handed person puts on tefillin, on the opposite hand that others put the tefillin on. So the first source is Yodcha Zeh small. Where it says Yodcha is small. What did Rav Nassan respond? Ein Tzarech. You don't need that first source. So the Gra, right, is very exacting in the wording of the Gemara. When Rav Nassan says Ein Tzarech, what does it mean Ein Tzarech? You don't need that source. That means that there's no disagreement between the first source in the Gemara versus Rav Nassan. There's no machlokah. There cannot be a disagreement between the Gemara's first source versus Rav Nassan's source of Kshartem Uchtavtem. Okay? Now, according to the first source of the Gemara, is Ktiva, with writing, determine which hand you put the tefillin on? Certainly not. Because the first source is unrelated to writing. It's only Rav Nassan's source that relates to writing. But the first source in the Gemara, that by default Yodcha means the left, obviously writing is not a factor. And if, according to Rabbi Nassan, writing was the factor, that means there would be a disagreement between the first source of the Gemara versus the second source of the Gemara. The Gra says it can't be, because Nassan said, Ein Tzarech, it's not necessary. When you say that your source is not necessary, you're not saying that I disagree with you in principle, or that I have any, or that there's any practical difference between me and you. It means to say, I don't need your source, I have another source. Do we follow that? So the Gra comes to the following conclusion. The Gra says, since, according to the first source in the Gemara, writing is certainly not a factor, then even Rav Nassan, who proposes Ukshartem Uchtavtem, by that same token, writing is certainly not a factor. That's the Gra in Orach Chaim Siman Chav Zayin. So now the Gra is making a new proposal that we haven't seen until now. Until now, we worked with the presumption of the Sefer Eshkol and Aguda and other Rishonim that learned that this case where somebody does tennis with one hand and writing with the other hand, it depends on what your source is. If your source is Yadcha, Yadkea, then Rav Malachs is Kaveh. If your source is Kshartem Uchtavtem, then writing is Kaveh. According to the Gra, it's not true. According to the Gra, according to all the opinions of the Gra, even Rav Nassan, who learns from Kshartem Uchtavtem, that there's a link between writing and tying the tefillin, even according to him, Rav Malachas is Kaveh. How do you explain this? Right, the answer is, as we'll see, that I'm going to jump in the reference sheet. I would like to revise my order of the reference sheet. Jump to number 18 in the reference sheet. There's a Shut HaRashba, okay, that this is quoting Rabbeinu Yol Halevi. Rabbeinu Yol Halevi was the father of the Ravya, okay. So the Rabbeinu Yol Halevi was asked, Rav Nassan said, just as you tie with the right hand, just as you write with the right hand, so too you tie the tefillin with the right hand. So he was asked the following question: how do you know that writing is done with the right hand? Who says you have to write a mezuzah with the right hand? So what did the Rabbeinu Yol answer? Number 18 in the reference sheet. He says the Torah doesn't care if it's the right or left hand. The Torah wants it to be a chashava writing. What is a chashava writing? The best writing that you can do. I'm assuming that he's based on the concept of Zek Heli Van Vei. The Torah requires that when you do a mitzvah, you do the mitzvah in the most beautiful way possible. So the most beautiful way to write your mezuzah is by using the hand that writes best. Follow that? Mm-hmm. The hand that writes best will produce the nicest mezuzah. So he says, if the Torah says write a mezuzah, the Torah wants the best quality writing that you can do, correct? So the Torah also wanted the best tying that you could do. When you tie the tefillin, if you tie the tefillin using your right hand, if you put it on the left arm and you tie it with the right arm, you're doing a good tying. It's a stronger tying. Whereas if I put it on the right hand, I'm going to be tying the tefillin with a weaker hand. I won't be doing the act of tying in the best way possible. So he says, what the underlying link was really meant to convey the following. Just as when you write mezuzah, you do the best possible writing, when you tie the tefillin, the Torah wanted the best possible tying. That's the explanation of Rabbeinu Yoel Halevi, quoted by the Rashba. This Rabbeinu Yoel Halevi is quoted also by the Marami Rudenberg, number 19 in the reference sheet. Number 20 is quoted by the Rav Yah, and it's also quoted by the Shibbolei Haleket. So you see that there are 4 Rishonim quoting Rabbeinu Yoel Halevi. That means there's a total of 5 Rishonim that explain why even if your source is Ukshartem Uchtavtem, you will still be using the hand that plays 10 is best. Because the hand that plays 10 is best will give you the best tying of the tefillin.
Who was Rabbi Yoel Halevi?
Rabbi Yoel Halevi was the father of the Rav Yah. The Rav Yah was one of the Bali Tosfot. Rav Yah was a student of the Yereim. Okay, Rabbi Lezer Mimitz, a German sage. Rabbi Lezer Mimitz was a student of the Ri. Okay, he was also the Rabbi was also the Rabbi of the Or Zarua. Rabbi Yitzchak Avinu was the Rabbi of the Rosh. So that's the Masara there. You have it. Rashi, his grandchildren. Rashi was a student of Rabbi Yitzchak Halevi, Rabbi Ben Yakar. He was a student of all the students of Rabbeinu Gershom. Rabbeinu Gershom lived about 1,000 years ago. Right? So Rabbeinu Gershom came to Germany. Rabbeinu Gershom had, I don't know if he had direct contact with Rav Hai Gaon, or if his father was a student of Rav Hai Gaon, but Rabbeinu Gershom bordered to Rav Hai Gaon. Rav Hai Gaon was the leading sage of the generation. The entire Messiah of Torah goes through Rav Hai Gaon. In fact, it was the students of Rav Hai Gaon that spread Torah throughout the world. Okay, so Rabbeinu Gershom was either a student of Rav Hai, or he had contact, or he was a student of Rav Hai Gaon's students. He had students who were Rashi's Rabbi, and Rashi learned with his grandson, the Rashbam, with his son-in-law, and the Rivan. Okay, so and Rashi's students. So one of the Ri Hazaken was a student of, was a great grandson of Rashi. The Ri Halevi was a Rebbe of the Yereim, was a Rebbe of the Rav Yah, was a Rebbe of the Or Zarua, was a Rebbe of the Rosh, and the Rebbe of the students of the Rebbe of the Ram Rudenberg, And the Ram Ruden was a Rebbe of the Rosh, and all the students of the Rosh spread Torah throughout the world. The Tur was obviously a student of his own father, the Hagos Maiminiyah, the Mordechai, and then you have, that was at least the Ashkenazic line of Masara. Okay, so the Rabbeinu Yoel Halevi was a father of the Rav Yah. So you have already 5 very important Rishonim that said explicitly that there is no such thing, that the whole proposal, this whole notion that writing is more of a determining factor, he says there's no such thing. Right? It's the stronger hand. The Torah is not saying since you write with this hand, tie the tefillin with this hand. The Torah was basically saying that we want a good writing, we want the best writing possible, we want the best act of tying possible. So this explains what the Gra meant. The Gra said there can't be a disagreement. It cannot be that Reb Nosson would maintain that writing is the determining factor, because if Reb Nosson maintained that the writing was the determining factor, that means he would disagree with the Tanna Kama. He would disagree with the first source of the Gemara. It can't be that he disagrees because he used the wording Ein Tzarach. So this is a very good example. Yeah, yesterday we talked about, this is a shiur, a case study of Derech HaPsika, where number one you see that the ruling of the Rosh, the Rambam and the Rif, the 3 titans amongst the Rishonim ruled that Rov Malachos is Kaveya. So by that criteria, Rov Malachos we would rule that way. Rov Rishonim hold that way. Most of the Rishonim hold that Rov Malachos, that the tennis is the more determining factor. And by that, even according to the derech of the Marshal, where you have to take apart the Gemara and you have to read every word in the Gemara carefully to come to a conclusion, even by that criteria, we're led to believe that Rov Malachos is Kaveya because of two words that were mentioned in the Gemara. You see the Gra, 0 is in and 2 words, Ein Tzarach. And by that, it's also a good exercise of getting the underlying principle of the Gemara. The Gemara makes a link, but what's the underlying concept of the link? And that's why we turn to the Rashba, the Marami Rudenberg, and the Rav Yah, and the Shibbolei, all of whom quote the Rabbeinu Yoel Halevi, that says that the underlying concept in the Gemara is that the Gemara is linking writing and Rov Malachos because the Gemara wants a good writing. Okay? Now, carrying on in the Gemara, number 9 in the reference sheet, right? Remember, the Gemara discusses Rav Nosson's source was Ukshartem Uchtavtem, number 9 in the reference sheet, and Rav Ashi's source was Yad Cha, Yad Ke, the weaker hand. So the Gemara describes a little debate between Rav Abba and Rav Ashi. So we'll read the last 3rd line over there, number 9 in the reference sheet. So Amar there Rav Abba, Rav Ashi. So Rav Abba says to Rav Ashi, when it says Yad Cha, how do you know it means the weaker hand? Maybe the implication is Yad Ka'ach. Now, there's a rule in the Gemara that Hey and Het are interchangeable. Okay? No, but this is a Chaf. Yad Kea, it's not a chaf. It's not a ches, it's a chaf. Okay. So he wanted, I guess, read Yad Shebekoichacha, the hand that has more koach. So he immediately says Miksiv Bechet. It doesn't say it with the word chet. Hey and het, by the way, the Ashkenazim don't pronounce the chet properly. Because according to Rabbi Sadia, and it's mentioned a few places in the Zohar, he says that the enunciation of the 22 letters of the alphabet are divided into 5 groups. Right? There's the letters that come from the lips, letters those that are use the teeth, the tongue. This is the cheich, right, which is the upper section, and then there's the throat, which is called the goren. So he says that the hey and the het come from the goren. The chaf comes from the cheich, from this part of the. Right? The het and the hey come from the goren. So you see that hey and het almost sound the same. So we're pronouncing, the Ashkenazim that are pronouncing the het like the chaf, it's obviously a mistake, it's obviously not correct. But you see all of a sudden in the way when the Torah expounds the Torah, when we learn drashas, we very often use the hey and the chet as interchangeable because they have almost the same sound. So he says it doesn't say chet, so therefore if you read it chet, if you use that license to pronounce the hey as chet, you'd say yad shebekoyach. I'm not sure how this plays out really. But so the Gemara says, Ketanoi, the Gemara wants to suggest that it's subject to Tanoic dispute. That means the Tanoim disagree what the real source for this is. Yadcha behezes malachermam yadcha l'Rabbi sagidem. They disagree how to expound that extra hey. According to the Tanakama Yadcha, that teaches us that you put tefillin on the left hand. What are the chayrim? How do the chayrim expound the extra hey? The Rabbi says sagidem. That means if somebody is an amputee, his arm has been cut off. According to the chayrim, he needs to put tefillin on. Now, let's just set something straight. The Gra is very clear about this. The Piskei Riyaz is very clear about this. The Piskei Rid is very clear about this. Just to clarify this whole debate about how an amputee should put on tefillin. Obviously, as we know, this is the premise of the entire issue. You put tefillin on the weaker hand, correct? Now, if somebody loses his hand, let's say from the elbow, but he still has the bicep, so there's no question that after somebody loses, God forbid, the lower part of the hand, that becomes the weaker hand. I put in the reference sheet from the Tzitzil letter number 16 in the reference sheet. This was a shayla of Ashi Sternbach, who happened to be my Mesader Kedushin in Antwerp. So Ashi Sternbach, who was the Ravid, Rosh Bedin in Antwerp, he wrote a shayla to the Tzitzil Yezer. His son, Shlomo, was baking matzahs here in Yerushalayim, and there was some sort of accident, and he lost his hand. I'm not sure how does somebody lose a hand in maybe the large machine that was kneading the dough. I don't know exactly how it happened, but he had some sort of accident. He lost his hand. Now this Shlomo was left-handed. He was born left-handed, so his entire life, right, he was putting tefillin on the left hand. Okay. Now what happened is he lost his right hand. So now what became the weaker hand?
The right hand.
The right hand became weaker. Now, let's read it inside, okay? Okay, v'nikta la yadeh hasmailis. He lost, see, I didn't get the details right. See, well, excuse me. V'nikta la yadeh, it's number 16 in the reference sheet. Okay, he had an asan, he had a tragedy where he was baking matzahs, and then he lost his left hand was cut off. Okay? So now, the question is, he was always putting tefillin on the right hand, correct? Because that was his weaker hand. Mm-hmm. But now, obviously the hand that he lost, the hand that was amputated, that is now the weaker hand. So maybe he should change the hand that he puts tefillin on.
He lost the left hand.
Exactly, he lost the left hand. So he should be putting the tefillin on the hand, which was amputated, because if the hand becomes amputated, by definition, that becomes the weaker arm. So obviously, the tefillin should be going on the hand that had this amputation. Correct? So the Shizah said, indeed, that's what he should be doing. Okay. So if somebody had a hand that's amputated, but he still has the bicep, which is the place for the tefillin, there it's obvious he'll be putting the tefillin on the hand that was severed. Okay. But the question is like this. The disagreement, the debate in the Gemara, right, is concerning somebody that lost his hand above the bicep. So now the question is, according to the Talmud Kama, no point to putting on tefillin because he doesn't have a weak hand anymore. his weaker hand, he doesn't have a weak hand anymore. He only has one hand, which is strong. So according to them, you don't put tefillin on. Forget about putting on tefillin. According to the chayrim, right, what's the halacha? He should be putting on the stronger hand. If you don't have a weaker hand, so put on the stronger hand. So let me repeat what I said. If somebody still has a bicep, he puts it on the bicep. The hand that lost the lower half of the arm, of course, that hand will be the hand that still has a bicep, so put the hand on. That's now the weaker hand. The problem is if he got cut where he was amputated above the bicep, God forbid. So then, according to the Tanna Kama, don't bother putting on tefillin at all. And according to the Chem, if you have no weaker hand, at least put on the stronger hand. How do we rule? The Piskei Rid, the Piskei Riyaz. The halach is we rule that you don't put tefillin on. If somebody loses the hand above the bicep, doesn't bother putting on tefillin.
Really?
Yeah, because he doesn't have a weaker hand.
What about when you say tefillin? Is there any? Have they ever discussed? Okay, why not wear half your tefillin?
Yes, you have to, and you put tefillin on the head. When I say tefillah, it's really the singular of tefillin is really called tefillah. But I use the word tefillin because it confuses people. I say the word tefillah, they think I'm talking about prayer. Okay? Actually, when I wrote up a tshuva on this specific topic, I had a debate within, should I use the word tefillah or tefillin? If I wrote the word tefillah, it might confuse people. They might think I'm talking about prayer. Well, grammatically, I should not be saying tefillin, because since he's only going to be putting on one tefillah, I should be saying in the singular. So I did a random search. I got to do a computer, a random search, and I saw that some achronim do it this way, some achronim do it that way. Right? The Marshal blasted his cousin, the Ramah, for not following grammar. So he says, I never learned diktuk, the Ramah says. He says, when I write, my objective is to make myself as clear as possible. I want to make myself as clearly understood as possible. Diktuk is not the priority.
Is a lot of Rosh Hashanah?
Well, Rosh Hashanah causes its own problems. I once saw a whole bunch of case studies where Rosh Hashanah could actually misconstrue. There are some cute examples where an abbreviation actually misconstrued the intention of the Gemara. Okay? So basically follow this cheshbon. So this debate, if an amputee, from now when I talk about an amputee, I'm talking about an amputee that lost his arm above the bicep. This debate, of whether or not an amputee should put on tefillin, is the same debate Rav Nosson had with Rav Ashi. According to Rav Ashi, that Yodcha comes to teach us that you put tefillin on the left hand. That drush is not available to teach me that an amputee should put on tefillin, so an amputee does not put on tefillin. According to Rav Nosson, that the source that you put the tefillin on the left hand comes from Kshartim Uchtavtim, so Yodcha is available to teach me that an amputee does put on tefillin. So since we rule that an amputee is patur from tefillin, that means we don't rule like Rav Nosson, we rule like Rav Ashi. Follow that? Inasmuch that we maintain that Yodcha is not available to teach me that an amputee puts on tefillin, therefore we rule that an amputee does not put on tefillin. So that means that our source that you're supposed to put tefillin on is from Yodcha, not from Ukshartim Uchtavtim. Because if our source is Ukshartim Uchtavtim, then Yodcha would be available to teach me that an amputee has to put on tefillin. We don't rule that way. This is the Gra and the Aruch HaShulchan both say this way, and that's why the Gra and the Aruch HaShulchan both rule that it's not writing, right? It's Rav Malachas. So basically there are two arguments to be said that Rav Malachas is Kaveh. The first argument is that we certainly rule like Rav Ashi for two reasons. Rav Ashi was the latter sage, and he learned it from Yodcha, so therefore it has nothing to do with writing. The second proof is we must rule like Rav Ashi, because if we rule like Rav Nosson, the Kshartim Uchtavtim teaches me that Rav Malachas is that you put it on the weaker hand, then Yodcha would be available to teach me that an amputee puts on tefillin, and we don't rule that way. And the other argument is that even if you do rule like Rav Nosson, even if you did hold the Rav Nosson, Kshartim Uchtavtim doesn't mean that the ksiva is kaveya. Doesn't mean that writing is kaveya. The only thing that Kshartim Uchtavtim teaches me that you have to do a good writing, that means you do a good tying, okay? So you see how the overwhelming proof is in favor of the opinion that Rav Malachas is kaveya. Okay? Well, there's no obviously putting a tefillah on your... Oh, you mean an amputee if somebody lost it. So then you would put only one tefillah on the head. I remember there's a famous picture of Gorin at the Kotel blowing the shofar. You know the famous picture? If you look carefully at the picture, you'll see Rav Gorin has a pair of tefillin on his head, and the soldier next to him was one of his students is wearing the tefillin shal yad. So in his memoirs, in his book, Ba'ozu B'Kvura, he writes that he wanted to come to the Kotel at least wearing tefillin. So his student says, lend me half your tefillin. So Rav Gorin was wearing the shal roish, and the student was wearing the shal yad. Now the Gemara says explicitly that if you don't have a shal yad, you wear the shal roish. But the Gemara says if you have both, you have to first put on the shal yad and then the shal roish, because the halach says that you're not supposed to have the tefillin So which implies that you're only supposed to put on a tshal if you have a tefillin sheyad. So I'm not sure, Rav Goren was certainly aware of that halacha, but he must have maintained that since I have a student who wants half the tefillin, so I'm like a person that only has one pair, that only has the shal roish. Okay? But I'm thinking maybe it would have been better for Rav Goren to wait so you can put on but not necessarily. I think Rav Goren was right, because if you only have the shal roish, if he's willing to give you the shal roish, he's not willing to give you the shal yad, so you wear what you have. Right. If you have both, then enachanami, you're not allowed to put the shal roish before the shal yad. So this requirement that you only put the shal roish on if you have the shal yad, that's if you have both. Rav Goren said, if my student is willing to lend me his shal roish and not shal yad, I belong to the category of a person that only has one, so I'm not subject to this halacha. That's why Rav Goren must have reasoned.
The order of the parashiyos is where on the shal roish?
Both. The debate between Rashi and Rabbeinu Tam is the order Havayas Be'emsa or Kisidron. Rashi says Kisidron. According to Rabbeinu Tam, it's V'hayim Shemayla Kiviyach in the middle. That's a debate that manifests both in the Shal Yad and the Shal Rosh, but both. The Shal Yad, the Shal Rosh, you can fix it. You take out, on the Shal Rosh you have 4 separate parchments, so you can change Rabbeinu Tam to be, but on the Shal Yad, right, it's the order how it's on one parchment, so therefore you would have to replace the parchment if you wanted to change Shal Yad to Shal Rosh. Okay? Alright, so that's basically the proof. The Ber Halacha already had a trouble. The Ber Halacha, in the times of the Ber Halacha, the most common reality was actually the other way around. The common reality was that they were being forced, the school children were being forced to write with the right hand. So what happened is they ended up writing with one hand, and naturally they were left-handed, so they were doing everything else with the left. So the Ber Halacha says that the writing shouldn't be a factor. He says, but for some reason, everybody's using the writing as a factor. So the Ber Halacha finds this perplexing, number 28 in the reference sheet. He finds this whole idea perplexing. Why are we using writing as the factor? Shouldn't we be following Rav Rishonim? Most of the Rishonim hold that Rav Malachas is the determining factor, not the writing. So the Ber Halacha wanted to make the following argument. He says, since they could really play tennis with both hands, that's the doichak. It's a very forced proposal. It's not so convincing, but he wanted to be miyashiv. Rav Yashiv already points out in 27 the Reverend Shida that the Ber Halacha was trying to reconcile the minog with Rav Yishayim. He says, since they could, if they wanted, they really, really wanted, they could play tennis with both hands. So they're shaylet b'shnei yadav. They play tennis better with the left hand, right? But if they really want to, they can play tennis with the right hand. So they have the din of shaylet b'shnei yadav, which means to say, according to this proposal of the Ber Halacha, every single time a person writes with one hand, and he does Rav Malachas with the other hand, he's considered a shaylet b'shnei yadav. We view him as a fully ambidextrous person, and therefore he should be putting on tefillin like most people. And again, as I did my little survey, this is the 10th time, I'm obviously very proud of my little survey because I keep on mentioning it again and again, that Chaim, most people are like you, where they're writing with the left, and they're doing Rav Malachas with the other hand, with the other. So they should be considered fully ambidextrous because they have advantages with both hands, right? Each hand has its respective advantage, so which, according to many Rishonim, we'll see, in fact, this is the way of the Bach. According to the Bach, number 34 in the reference sheet, according to the Bach, there's no such opinion that holds that writing is a determining factor. He says that Rabbeinu Yechiel MiParis, quoted by the Torah, said that, read the Lashon of the Torah, number 32 in the reference sheet, Pirush Rabbeinu, Davka Kisha'isa Kal Malachta B'Smal, if somebody's fully left-handed, if he's writing with the right hand, even though he's playing tennis with the left hand, he's he's considered a fully ambidextrous person. The Bach interpreted that to mean that if somebody is writing with the right and playing tennis with the left, he's ambidextrous. So he didn't mean to say that writing is a determining factor. He meant to say that writing is also a factor. You see the critical difference between whether you say writing is the factor versus if you say writing is also a factor? If you say writing is the factor, that means writing determines everything. But according to Bach, that's not what Rabbi Yechiel MiParis meant. Rabbi Yechiel MiParis meant to say that writing is also a factor. In what sense? That it renders the person being ambidextrous. So therefore, according to my little survey, where most people today are doing what Chaim is doing, where they're writing with the left, and they're doing it playing tennis with the right, according to the Bach, he's ambidextrous. Writing is also a factor. Fine, so if writing is also a factor, so you're ambidextrous. How does an ambidextrous, fully ambidextrous person put on tefillin? Like everybody else, like most people. That's the ruling of the Ugras Moshe. That's also the ruling, my interpretation of the smak, number 36 in the reference sheet. Right? The only reason that I could find that it says explicitly that writing is the only factor is Rabbeinu Simcha, quoted from the Goy's Maimonides, 37 in the reference sheet. If you look at there, he says, Afilum kaisav b'smal. Here, Rabbeinu Simcha, quoted Rabbeinu Maimonides, is the reason that actually spells it explicitly that writing is the only factor. Okay? There's also a strong indication that was Rabbeinu Peretz, Haggadah Rabbeinu Peretz. So basically what it turns out is there... Sorry?
He's telling you to learn to write with a right.
Yeah, he's telling you to learn how to write with a right. Correct. So there are 3 shittas in the Rishonim. One sheet in the Rishonim is the Rambam, the Rif, the Rosh, the Sefer Truma, and according to my conviction is that that's the opinion of the Rashba, the Ram Rudenberg, the Shabbat Leket, all quoting the Rabbeinu Alevi, that Rav Malachas, tennis is the determining factor. Tennis, using a hammer, whatever else. That's the only factor. Writing is a non-factor. The other opinion of the Rishonim is the opinion of the Smak, I believe, and the Magen had a little bit of a different interpretation, but you can see the Smak number, where did I put the Smak? Number 31 in the reference sheet. It's the opinion of the Smak, the Bach's interpretation of Rabbeinu Chiyom Paris, that writing is also a factor, which means that if you write with one hand, you do malachas with the other hand, you're fully ambidextrous, so you do malachas like great people. Rabbeinu Simcha, he maintains that only writing is the factor. Now, I think that in the cases that I have seen, that you are writing with the left and doing everything else with the right, according to the Rambam and the Rif, your writing is not a factor. And even if writing is a factor, it only means it's also a factor. So you should be malachas like most people. I just find it very unreasonable that Rabbeinu Simcha, one Rishon, should override the whole slew of Rishonim. Rabbeinu Simcha was a student of Rashi. Okay? I'm making a convincing argument. I'm like a lawyer in court, trying to fight my case in favor of this opinion. And Chaim, you said the Rav told you to treat you as a left-handed person, and that's what all the Rabbanim, that's what most Rabbanim tell people. Right? But if they asked me, I wouldn't say that. Okay? Yeah, exactly. So, by the way, another...
Well, having done this for the last 50 years, I think
so what you can do is after davening, some say that after davening you put it on the other hand. But if you've been doing it for 50 years, it's a bit daunting to tell somebody to change what he's been doing for 50 years. And that's the attitude to most people. Listen, I've been doing this for 50 years. Please don't tell me that... Okay, anyways. Yeah, so I'm sorry if I won't be able to sleep tonight. But don't worry, my nephew's the same story. My sister wrote to me and says, my nephew's the same story as Chaim. I didn't even know this. I arranged this tefillin and I got left-handed. She asked me to get left-handed tefillin for him. So he actually, my sister now tells me he's able to write with both hands. I said, if he's able to write with both hands, then certainly even from a writing perspective, he's ambidextrous. Right. So I see no reason why my nephew, she might be watching this right now, I don't know, but she'll be listening to the recording, she told me. I don't see any reason why my nephew, I hope you'll forgive me, because he should be putting on the left. If he writes with both hands, then even from a writing perspective, he's ambidextrous. I got him a left-handed tefillin, which means that he'll be putting tefillin on the right hand. And I think he should be doing it. Even according to Rabbeinu Simcha, if he writes with both hands, he must be able to. Even, that I don't understand. I'm not sure, but sorry. Okay. So, and also another thing I find perplexing. According to Rabbeinu Simcha, why do we need the drasha of Yad Charal? Who needs the drasha of Yad Charal? If Ksharta Mechtatim is the only determining drasha, then why do we need Yad Charal? According to the other Rishonim, we don't rule like Rav Nassan. Or we rule like Rav Nassan, but he meant to say that you have to do a good time. But according to the Rabbeinu Simcha, why do they need the drasha of Yad Charal? So I found the question. So the Taz wants to explain that Yad Cha, even according to Yad Cha, what's considered the weaker hand? That's determined by writing. It's a big daichak. Why should writing determine what's the strong and weaker hand? When it comes to avodah in the Beis Hamikdash, is writing going to be a factor? Why should writing determine what's a stronger or weaker hand? The Prima Gadim is very matchik, and he wants to say that we needed the drasha of Yadcha for somebody who doesn't know how to write. Sharate Muchtaftim was needed for people that write, and Yadcha was needed for people. There was a guy, a wealthy guy in Toronto. He was a good businessman, but he didn't know how to write. He was completely illiterate. When he signed the check, he didn't even do it in writing. He would have some sort of symbol, I don't know, smiley face or something. He couldn't write. But he still managed to run a successful business. Probably because he was not, I'm supposing that maybe because he was never diagnosed for dyslexia, perhaps. That's why he was never... Today, a lot of people have that, where they were never diagnosed for dyslexia. So I've made my argument that Rav Malacha should be kaveya. Right? And certainly for somebody who's writing with the left and doing it over the right. It was the other way around. He was writing with the right, and he was doing Rav Malachas with the left, so then it would be not as conclusive. Because if you treat him as a shayld b'shnei yadav, if you treat him as fully ambidextrous, he'll be putting on like most people. If you say Rav Malachas is kaveh, then you'll treat him as a left-handed person. Okay? But again, let me repeat myself. If you're doing the writing with the left, and you're doing Rav Malachas with the right, then both according to the school of Rishonim that Rav Malachas is kaveh, you put on tefillin like most people, and according to the school of Rishonim, which is the way many Achronim learn, the Gris Moshe, the Shaila Meishiv, the Tzemach Tzedek, and many more. Right? Even according to the school of Rishonim, the Smak and the Bachs and Terbezher Reinu Chil Mi Paris, even according to that school of Rishonim, your Shad B'Shnei Yadav, you should be putting on like most people.
So it's very much easier to functionally to write with your right than with your left. Because I remember I was forced to use a fountain pen. A fountain pen,
and then you'd smudge the pen. Very good. That's the challenge of writing in Hebrew. When I write in Hebrew, I often smudge my writing. Then, when I write in English, I don't have the problem of smudging my writing. As a left-handed person, then it's easier to write in Hebrew. Exactly, you won't smudge your writing. Okay. Part 4 of the Shita, something that you already caught onto, right? The question is like this. What if you train yourself to write? Let's say you do maintain that writing is the determining factor. What if you're not naturally writing with your right hand? I know I had a friend of mine in school, he was a Kohen, so he trained himself to write with the right hand because he wanted to do service in the Beis HaMikdash. So he thought that writing with his right hand would make him kosher to serve in the Beis HaMikdash. I'm not so convinced. Because I think in the Beis HaMikdash, writing is not the determining factor. Rav Malachas, unless he trained himself to play tennis with his right hand, and shchita, everything else, malika. There's a big machlokes if why is a kohen who's left-handed apostle? Why is a kohen who's left-handed apostle? Some Rishonim learn because he's a balmum. Other Rishonim, he's considered blemished because he's a left-handed person. Other Rishonim learn that no, it's because the avodah needs to be performed with the right hand. It's a machlokes Rishonim. So if he trains himself to do,
it says anything like kmitza in terms of the right hand. I don't remember.
Kmitza, yeah, it's a Mishnah in Menachos that says the kmitza with the left, you have to do kmitza with the right hand. Mishnah in Menachos. It's Vachim too, actually. Okay, so according to the Derech HaChaim in Nesivis, number 240 in the reference sheet, he says that if you train yourself, if you belong to the school that like Rabbeinu Simcha, if you rule like Rabbeinu Simcha, that holds that writing determines how you should be putting on tefillin, then even if you train your hand to write with the right hand, training will render you a right-handed person. That's the ruling of the Mishnah Berurah, and that's stated explicitly in one of the Rishonim, number 42, the Mordechai. Okay? No. Excuse me. The Mordechai says the opposite. Number 42. The Mordechai seems to say the opposite. Look at the Mordechai. Im hirgal atzmi lasas shum davar biyad liyav hargalasim klum lemikri itayad. You see number 42 in the reference sheet? According to the Mordechai, training doesn't change your status. Now, as you pointed out, whatever you're born with, that you're defined by how you are born. Okay? No choice. It's anti-progressive. You are defined by how you were born. Okay? As you pointed out, that the Rabbeinu Peretz says you should train yourself, the Smak says you should train yourself. So the Rabbeinu Peretz, Smak is clearly of the opinion that training, if you train yourself to write with the other hand, you change your status. The Mordechai. Now, the truth is, if this is a misnomer, and I talked about this at length, if you look very carefully at the Mordechai, and it would be too complicated for me to start taking apart the wording of the Mordechai. The Mordechai is self-contradictory. But if you give a very careful reading of the Mordechai, and you can look in my Sefer and I demonstrate, if you read the Mordechai very clearly, he presents both schools. He first presents the school that writing is the determining factor, then he presents the school that Rav Malachas is the determining factor. And he contradicts himself. In the first section of his treatise on the topic, he says, if you train yourself, it changes your status. And then in the second section, he says, if you train yourself, right, it doesn't. In one section, he says that training yourself will change your status. In the other section, he says all determined by how you were born. And the Mordechai Bennett over there already points out that the Mordechai is self-contradictory. And I made the following argument that it's very clear to me that the Mordechai had a very unique opinion. He says, if you belong to the school that writing determines how you should put on tefillin, then training will change your status. Because the Torah cares about how you write your mezuzah. How will you write? If you want to get the best mezuzah, how will you write? So if you belong to the school that writing determines your status, then training will change your status. If you belong to the school, but the stronger hand, he says, that's how you were born. That's how your brain was wired. Okay? So therefore I maintain, that's my chidush, that even according to the Mordechai, if you belong to the school of Rabbeinu Simcha, then you train the way you're writing, it will change your status. Follow what I'm saying?
Yeah,
because even though the Mordechai said it's determined how you were born, that's only if you belong to the school that the strength is the determining factor. Well, he gives two sections. He's very unclear. It's a very convoluted piece of writing. I had to break my head until I made heads and tails of this Mordechai. Yeah, he presented both schools. And when he talked about the school that maintains that writing determines, he said training will change your status. And when he talks about the school that discusses strength being the determining factor, he says that the way you're born determines.
Which one came last? Which one came last?
In the end, writing. Writing is the second one. Yeah, so he seems to maintain that writing is the determining factor. Even though the Ramah seems to have misquoted the Mordechai. I also have a problem with Ramah. Anyways, so basically, I would say that if you do belong to the school, but writing is a determining factor, you can train yourself and then you'll get out of the bushes. So which means to say, if you're writing with your left hand, train yourself to write with the right hand, and then you'll be... There was a dentist in my neighborhood who had the same situation as you. Right? He wrote with the left and did everything with the right. And he went to Rabbi Pfeiffer in South Africa, and he asked him what to do. So Rabbi Pfeiffer said, learn how to write ksiva stam with the right hand. Now Rabbi Pfeiffer clearly was concerned about that the writing that we talk about is only writing ksiva stam, writing mezuzah, sefer Torah. The writing that we talk about is a non-factor. That's the opinion. It's a machlokes in the Achrayim. What kind of writing determines? According to the Chesed L'Avram, number 45 in the reference sheet, it's only ksiva stam. I think that's the more convincing opinion because it says we linked. The opinion that says that writing is the more determining factor is because we linked writing mezuzahs with tying the tefillin. The Torah, when it linked writing and tying, it was talking about the category of writing sefer Torah, mezuzahs. So the Chesed L'Avram says that. So that's another argument. Right, that's another thing. Exactly. So according to you, Chaim, even if you, according to the Rishonim that holds that writing is the factor, it could be even according to them you should be putting on tefillin like most people because you're not a sefer stam unless you didn't tell me. So that's another argument that I made that even the Rabbanim are telling people that writing is determinant. I said, who says? Right? Could be even according to the Rishonim, writing is not a determinant factor in this specific case because they're not a sofer.
It doesn't say that a sofer has to be a right.
No, sofer doesn't need to be a right.
I know, it doesn't say that.
No, it only says with regards to avoid in the Beis HaMikdash. Doing service in the Beis HaMikdash, you have to be right-handed. Okay? And also, just to put the cherry on the top, to make my final case, and maybe I'll elaborate this. Let me see what the time is. No, it's 9:30. We'll save it for next year. I don't want to take away people's time. So I've made my case. We'll give one more shiur to this topic, and then I think we'll get on to the chicken controversy, and then maybe we'll turn to the two requests that people made. Number one regarding the kolel system, and the other one regarding the Zionism, the Shalosh Shvuot. Right? So bring your friends. It's going to get colorful. Okay. Let me see if there's any questions on the WhatsApp. I did want to say that people should. No, sometimes people that are joining us with Zoom, they say they want to ask questions. I said send it to my personal WhatsApp, and then you can. I'll read out the question. Okay. Thank you very much. Sure. Thank you. Maybe you know what? What would you prefer? Maybe we should just move on to a new topic next year.
So finish it.
5, but it'll take me maybe in 5
minutes.
5 minutes? Okay.
I gave up my day job anyway.
Okay. So if Chaim? No, so then Chaim needs to run. I don't want to hold him back. Okay, so we'll give him a shiur too.